Hello, my second reading for today is going to be from my second book for Amberley, Richard, Duke of York, King by Right. And this is a book that I was really keen to write, that I asked Amberley if I could write, because I think Richard, Duke of York has an incredibly interesting story, which is often skimmed over so that he's presented as a power-crazed, power-hungry warmonger who starts the Wars of the Roses. The bit I'm going to read to you today comes from chapter 19, which is entitled The Road to Dartford, and it follows on from the events of Cade's rebellion in 1450. The Parliament of 1450 achieved nothing but the exposure of wide divisions within the country that most were already aware of. Henry sat above the widening chasm as it increased in space between Somerset and York, both of whom viewed the other as the problem ruining the kingdom. A stronger personality than Henry's might still have forced these two powerful men to terms, but Henry continued to embrace Somerset at York's expense, increasing the power of one party while alienating the most powerful and popular faction. Still, there had been no question of the loyalty of all concerned to the king, only the fighting for influence over a man uninterested in the business of ruling. Before Parliament closed at the end of May 1451, there was to be more controversy. An Act of Resumption was passed, taking back grants made by the Crown in an attempt to help Henry to balance his books. After being free with his patronage, the household expenses of the King and Queen far outweighed their income. The Act asserted that Henry was £372,000 in debt and had an annual income of just £5,000. The minimum amount required to sustain his household was calculated at £24,000, leaving a shortfall of £19,000 to enable the king to live by his own means. To ease this unsustainable situation and take the pressure off a population too heavily taxed and whose goods were taken for the royal household but not paid for, land was taken back into royal hands, though the long list of exemptions limited the impact and probably sought only to ensure that the shortfall was met without creating further outrage. A petition was laid before Parliament which sought to rehabilitate the reputation of the late Duke of Gloucester, asking, as the chronicler Bennet wrote, that he might be proclaimed a true knight. And a longer document, which is undated and in poor condition, but which may be the petition Bennet spoke of, is extant, and it presents the case for Gloucester's pardon from the cloud that had hung over him since his death. He remained a deeply popular figure and was proving hard to erase from the public mind, a fact that added to York's popular backing and the suspicion that gathered about him in equal measure. Bennet's chronicle insists that the final session was ended abruptly by the arrest of Thomas Young, an MP and apprentice at law who supposedly tried to introduce a motion to have Richard, Duke of York, recognised as Henry's legal heir while the king remained childless. If Young did indeed try to bring such a motion, it's not recorded among the Parliament rolls, which suggests that it was made orally, or that it was considered too inflammatory to be enrolled. In 1455, Young was to petition Parliament for compensation for his arrest and confinement in the Tower for things said by him in the House of Commons, claiming the right of free speech for MPs as his defence. Young was granted his compensation, and this is another episode behind which many have seen York's hand at work. However, the Duke would gain little in reality by such a bill. It's possible that he feared Somerset's closeness to the king might allow the Beaufort interloper to talk Henry into making Edmund his heir. But the Beauforts had long been specifically barred from the succession, a fact which I now know isn't quite true thanks to Nathan Ammon's book. Richard was already widely considered Henry's heir and next in line to the throne until the king produced a son. Perhaps he wished to formalise the position to gain a better grip on power at court, or perhaps Thomas Young believed it was the right thing to do, either for the country or to ingratiate himself with the Duke. These incidents, combined with the civil unrest that had surrounded the Parliament since its opening, marked the beginning of an open feud between York and Somerset. The two dukes both believed in their right to be the king's chief adviser and the correctness of their cause. Henry was all but a spectator, seemingly oblivious to the tension his weak rule was causing and the impending eruption of troubles that went unresolved. York's reputation has long been that of a man driven by only one desire, to wear the crown. To date, this motive has been hard to justify, with evidence that might mean almost anything. Somerset was the king's favourite, and York was falling into opposition with the government. This period would be the greatest test of his character yet, and with the increased pressure it would surely become harder to conceal any previously disguised motives. Gregory's chronicle recorded in 1451 that there were many executions of London citizens for their talking against the king, having more favour unto the Duke of York than unto the king. Gregory does not give a figure of the damned men who were hanged, drawn and quartered, simply stating that they were permitted to be buried whole afterwards. At the same time, 9 men were beheaded in Rochester and their heads sent to London, where they were set on pikes on London Bridge, closely followed by another 12 heads. Although these executions are not specifically linked to support for York by Gregory, the implication seems clear. He concludes the year by writing that men call it in Kent the harvest of heads. Rebellions and uprisings in York's name were precisely what the Duke did not need, whether he coveted the throne or not. They would only serve to increase Henry's suspicion and provide ammunition to Richard's enemies. 4 months after Parliament closed, there was open warfare in England with armies in the field. The Earl of Devon and Lord Bonville were quarrelling over the right to the stewardship of the Duchy of Cornwall, and it is a damning indictment of the situation in the country that they felt able to muster a private army and take it to the field. At Lackham in Wiltshire, the Earl of Devon engaged in battle with the Earl of Wiltshire, who had taken Lord Bonville's side in the dispute. The Earl of Devon swiftly defeated Wiltshire and turned back to Somerset. Lord Bonville was entrenched at Taunton Castle, and Devon set about laying siege to it. Law and order was being disrupted deep within Somerset's homelands, yet Beaufort didn't act against those tearing around settling personal scores on the battlefield. After Parliament had ended, the Duke of York had stalked back to his Marcher fortress at Ludlow. He may have been licking his wounds after the session in Westminster, as no matter what he tried to do, Somerset was still safely ensconced within the protection of Henry's favour, and York seemed to have no say in the government of the land to which he was technically heir. After his grant in 1447 for life of the offices of Steward and Justice in Ayr south of the Trent and Master of the King's forests and parks in that region, York received 2 further grants of the same offices, both also for life, on the 13th of July 1450 and the 21st of March 1451. It's odd to keep reaffirming a grant for life when there's been no formal accusation of treason to place the appointment in doubt. The need to confirm the grants may be a signal of York's insecurity or a greater degree of misgiving about him than is otherwise obvious, though Henry was still apparently willing to show York that he was not out of favour, even if neither felt that the Duke was truly in favour. As Thomas Courtenay, Earl of Devon, laid siege to Taunton Castle, it was the Duke of York who marched out of Ludlow and headed over 100 miles south to Taunton, where he forced the men to come to peaceful terms. Devon had been a long-time ally of the Beaufort family when John and Cardinal Henry had been in power, but the rise of Suffolk had seen Courtenay's rival in the West Country, Lord Bonville, grow in favour. Bonville's daughter had married the son of William Talboys, a member of Suffolk's inner circle. This saw Courtenay's influence falter, and he quickly identified with York as the leader of opposition to the court party. During the Parliament that had recently closed down, Courtenay had been closely aligned to York and his reform agenda. Perhaps he believed that this would buy him some leeway as he sought to settle his dispute with Bonville by force. These new allegiances make it striking that York decided to sally out and halt the progress of a man who had offered him support against an enemy who had been closely allied to Suffolk. If York was seeking disruption of Henry's government for his own gains, then he was going about it in an odd way, by restricting the ambitions of allies seeking to make the most of the unrest in the country to consolidate their own power. It's true that Devon had first attacked the Earl of Wiltshire, whose father was the Earl of Ormond, York's deputy in Ireland, and that this may have caused York to take action. By stepping into Somerset's natural territory, the Duke was also able to highlight the absence of law and order in regions under his rival's control, but the fact remained that York chose to stop the siege rather than ignore it. With peace enforced, he returned to Ludlow. These don't appear to be the actions of a man desperately seeking a way to remove Henry from the throne. But this was only the beginning, rather than the end, of the tumult. All appeared quiet until the early days of 1452, when York suddenly felt compelled to write to the king. If his version of events is to be believed, the Duke of Somerset was conducting a sinister campaign to undermine York's reputation, in spite of the fact that the latter had kept himself well away from London and the king, and his only real input into the political establishment in the past year had been to stop a private war in the West Country. On the 9th of January, York penned a letter to his cousin the king from Ludlow. "Forasmuch as I, Richard, Duke of York, am informed that the king, my sovereign lord, is my heavy lord, greatly displeased with me, and hath in me a distrust by sinister information of mine enemies, adversaries, and evil willers, where God knoweth, from whom nothing is hid, I am, and have been, and ever will be, his true liegeman, and so I have before this divers times, as well by mouth as by writing, notified and declared to my said sovereign lord. And for that this notice so come unto me, of the displeasure of my said sovereign lord, is to me so grievous, I have prayed the reverend father in God, the Bishop of Hereford, and my cousin the Earl of Shrewsbury, to come hither and hear my declaration in this matter, wherein I have said to them that I am a true liegeman of my king, my sovereign lord, ever have been, and shall be, to my dying day. And to the very proof that it is so, I offer myself to swear that on the blessed sacrament, and receive it, the which I hope shall be my salvation at the day of doom. And so for my special comfort and consolation, I have prayed the said lords to report and declare unto the king's highness my said offer, and to the end and intent that I will be ready to do the same oath in presence of 2 or 3 lords, such as will please the king's highness, to send hither to accept it. In witness whereof I have signed this schedule with my sign manual, and set thereunto my signet of arms, written in my castle of Ludlow, the 9th of January, the 30th year of the reign of my sovereign lord, King Henry VI. York protested his innocence of the charges being whispered against him, and offered to swear an oath on the sacrament that he was not, nor had he ever been, anything other than Henry's true liegeman. Richard claimed that he had been informed of slanderous rumours being circulated about him and his intentions. It's hard to be certain whether such gossip was truly in use against the Duke, whether there had been some real belief that he was a threat, whether he was being fed misinformation in order to stir up trouble, or whether he'd received no actual intelligence, but felt the need to assert his loyalty against some unseen threat. It must have become hard for York to know whether he was growing paranoid or was genuinely under attack. Richard reminded Shrewsbury how glorious it had been when the king had kept France, reminiscing what laud, what worship, honour, and manhood was ascribed of all nations unto the people of this realm, while England controlled great swathes of France. In contrast, he lamented that derogation, loss of merchandise, lesion of honour, and villainy is said and reported generally unto the English nation for loss of the same. These words were clearly meant to appeal to the patriotism of the town, and their sense of outrage at the unavenged losses in France. York was stepping onto the front foot, and for the first time actively courting dissatisfaction with the government in his own name. He had received scant reward for his assistance in 1450, and seems to have reached the end of his tether. There was something else new in this letter too. Immediately after this inflammatory reminiscence, York names the prime cause of all of this trouble as the Duke of Somerset. For the first time he openly accuses Edmund Beaufort of what amounted to treason in the loss of Normandy, blaming the surrender for encouraging the King of France to take Gascony and Guienne too. Emboldened by Somerset's lack of resistance, so that now the French were looking to march on Calais and evict every trace of England from the continent. York then went on to tell the authorities of Shrewsbury that on his return from Ireland, as the king's true liegeman and servant, he had advised his royal majesty of certain articles concerning the weal and safeguard, as well as his most royal person, as the tranquillity and conservation of all this his realm, but that he had been utterly ignored. The reason that his advice had been set aside, he claimed, was the envy, malice, and untruth of the said Duke of Somerset, who laboureth continually about the king's highness for my undoing, and to corrupt my blood, and to disinherit me and my heirs, and such persons as be about me, without any desert or cause done or attempted on my part or theirs, I make our Lord judge. York continued to assure his audience that he meant to take action, but that he would be open in his dealings, to the intent that every man shall know my purpose and desire, drawing a direct contrast between himself and Somerset, who was supposedly whispering in shadows rather than behaving in an honourable manner and facing his opponent. York claimed that he had been forced into action by long sufferance and delays, but could wait no longer, for he saw that the Duke ever prevaileth and ruleth about the king's person, and that by this means the land is likely to be destroyed. Richard pronounced that he was fully concluded to proceed in all haste against him, with the help of my kinsmen and friends, in such wise that it shall prove to promote ease, peace, tranquillity, and safeguard of all this land, but also asserted that he would ensure his actions kept him within the bounds of my allegiance as it pertaineth to my duty. This is an open statement by York of his intentions and motive. While it must be taken with a note of caution, since it was propaganda for public consumption that had the aim of garnering support for York's cause, it's nevertheless valuable. Richard's previous correspondence with the king since his return had been couched in courtly language, assuring the king of his allegiance and complaining of undefined rumours against him. Now he was openly naming Somerset as the cause of the country's woes and the man slandering him to the king. The assurances offered that York sought only to restore peace and order, much as he had offered to do for Henry during the Parliament after his return from Ireland, is also noteworthy. It doesn't tally with a man seeking to inflame the country against the king. While he might not openly state an aim to depose Henry, he would be unwise to swear an army to support the king he wished to cast down. The men wouldn't willingly fight against the monarch, so York could not offer this as his intention, but it's entirely possible that this letter is genuine. The fact is that York had returned from Ireland and offered to act to restore law and order on the king's behalf, recommending a mechanism to see it done. He quashed violence in London that might easily have turned into a riot, preventing Somerset from possibly becoming a victim of a lynch mob. In return for this, he'd been sent into another period of effective exile in Ludlow, from which he'd ventured into the south to stop another confrontation that might have spilled out into the wider country with no thanks. Instead of being rewarded for his dedication, he saw only plots against him that threatened to swallow not only him and his family, but the kingdom as well. When York wrote of keeping me within the bounds of my allegiance, as it pertaineth to my duty, he offered the strongest suggestion yet that an element of noblesse oblige lay behind his unwillingness to sit by and watch as Somerset destroyed England. He viewed it as his duty to protect the king, not to take the throne. Although doubt can be cast upon the reliability of what he said, it was the clearest indication to date that York sought not the throne, but Somerset's removal from Henry's side. To reinforce the assertion that he intended to act as an imposer of peace, York added a postscript to his letter, asking that Shrewsbury should only send to him men who be deemed in such wise by the way that they do no offence nor robbery nor oppression upon the people in legion of justice. He did not wish to descend on London with a rowdy mob who would turn what he was trying to achieve into another Cade rebellion. He must have known that he was about to walk a very fine line, and that the first sign of indiscipline among the men he was gathering would lay him wide open to a charge of treason. Carefully controlled, they could be his strong arm to lever Somerset from Henry's side. If they slipped and began to rob and riot, they would drop York into Somerset's lap. What he was planning could make or break Henry's kingship and York's life. Something must have convinced the Duke during his isolation at Ludlow to act against the causes of his poor situation. At some point during 1450 or 1451, Richard and Cecily had lost another son, Thomas. The dates of his birth and death are not known, a fact that perhaps reflects the upheaval in the country at the time, and York's removal from the centre of power. Around the start of January, Cecily had conceived again while the family was in effective exile at Ludlow. Having lost her fifth child in infancy, the grief must still have been raw, and the fear of what this pregnancy might bring very real. Cecily was nearly 37 years old and about to embark on the last of her 12 pregnancies. York was 40 and must have been developing a sense of his own mortality, only reinforced by the loss of so many children and the threat this pregnancy, as every other, posed to his wife. He had 3 sons and 3 daughters, 2 of whom were still unmarried. If he died with his family in a form of unofficial disgrace, he would be remembered as a failure, and he would leave them to fight the battles that he had sidestepped. With another child on the way, he might have wondered by the time he left Ludlow whether he was willing to have another child born into that situation. Perhaps Cecily's pregnancy was the spur that prompted him to act. Soon after this letter was sent, York marched out of Ludlow and made for London. Henry had withdrawn to the Midlands, perhaps on the advice of Somerset or Queen Margaret, who both seemed to have possessed a strong hold over the king's will by this point. When York arrived at London with an armed force at his back, he found the gates closed to him. Rather than seek to force an entry, he skirted the city and set up camp at Dartford, to the east of London, on the south side of the River Thames, on the 27th of February. Drawing on the expertise of his years of command, York set about establishing and supplying an army camp. An eyewitness account contained within the Cottonian rolls offers a detailed account of the setup. The Duke held the centre ground with 3,000 gunners and 8,000 men-at-arms. The Earl of Devon, clearly not upset by York's intervention at Taunton, was to the south of the Duke with 6,000 men, and Lord Cobham was to the north on the riverside with a further 6,000. On the river were 7 ships with their stuff, maintaining the supply line for the army, which could move up the Thames toward London or retreat further away if needed. The court hadn't been idle in the Midlands. Henry was already heading back south with a force believed to be as large as York's own. It was a telling replay of the beginning of Cade's rebellion, and it must have seemed likely that the king would attack, not least because it was more likely Somerset who was driving events, motivated by a need to defend himself from York's now open aggression. Henry, however, sent ambassadors to ascertain York's demands. This embassy consisted of William Waynflete, Bishop of Winchester, Thomas Bourchier, Bishop of Ely, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, his son and namesake, the Earl of Warwick, Lord Beauchamp, and Lord Sudeley. This was a prestigious and weighty delegation, no doubt in recognition of York's station. Waynflete had been handpicked by the king as his great-uncle's successor. Thomas Bourchier was brother to the Viscount Bourchier and half-brother to Humphrey Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. The Bourchiers were descended from Anne, the daughter of Edward III's youngest son, Thomas of Woodstock. The 2 earls were York's brother-in-law and nephew. Lord John Beauchamp was a relative of the Beauchamp Earls of Warwick and Lord Treasurer since Lord Say's death at Cade's hands. Ralph Butler, Lord Sudeley, came from a long line of barons and had made his fortune during the successes in France, building the impressive Sudeley Castle with the proceeds of war on his return. The inclusion of 2 of York's wife's relatives is telling, not least because of the part they were to play in later events. At this point, it's clear to see that they were, at least publicly, aligned against York and with the king, perhaps feeling that he'd gone too far in taking up arms against Henry, even if his true target was Somerset. It was perhaps felt in the court party that they might hold some sway with York. Salisbury had been one of those to whom York had offered to swear his oath of loyalty to Henry, so they may well have been close, and Salisbury probably knew, and perhaps sympathised with, York's grievances better than most. Salisbury was in his early 50s by now, and was perhaps able to speak freely with the Duke. His son was 23 and one of the richest men in the kingdom, now that he was Earl of Warwick. The court party was keen to show Richard that some of the most powerful spiritual and temporal figures in the kingdom were not with him in this, aside from Somerset, the Queen, and the King himself. The embassy asked York for his terms, and the Duke made one demand, that the Duke of Somerset be arrested and removed from the King's side. Fabian's Chronicle records that Richard sent word to the King that he nor none of the company intended none hurt unto the King's person, nor to any of his council, being lovers of the common weal, and of him and his land. But his intent and purpose was to remove from him a few evil-disposed persons, by whose means the common people were grievously oppressed, and the commonalty greatly impoverished, of the which he named, for principal, the Duke of Somerset. The men returned to the king with the message, and Henry sent back word that Somerset had been seized and would face charges as the Duke wished. Elated, York disbanded his army completely on the 1st of March and went to the king's camp. As he entered Henry's tent, he realised too late that he'd been deceived. Somerset stood at Henry's side, no doubt grinning in his victory. It's unclear whether Henry was the author of the deceit. It has been suggested that Henry did in fact order Somerset's arrest, only for Queen Margaret to insist that he be released again. Given that Henry had cited Margaret's desire for it as a reason for handing back Maine and Anjou, it doesn't seem beyond the realms of possibility that she caused her husband to go back on his word, but there's no clear evidence either way. Richard was seized, having entered the king's presence in good faith and divested himself of 23,000 armed supporters on the basis of Henry's word. He must surely have felt outraged to be treated so dishonourably, and to be taken prisoner in front of a man who was now surely his arch-rival. Somerset had won another victory over the Duke of York, and was determined to ram it home. For his part, Richard had made a grand play, and had suffered an ignominious defeat where he had thought to find victory. His humiliation was not to be kept private, though. On the 10th of March 1452, Richard, Duke of York, rode into London in front of the king as a high-status prisoner. Taken to St Paul's Cathedral, a huge building in Richard's day capable of holding thousands, he was forced to recite a humbling oath of loyalty to Henry. Making the pledge was not embarrassing. Loyalty to the king was precisely the cause York had stated for his march to London. The shame came in so public an affair that he must have known was orchestrated by Somerset and approved by a queen who thought far more of the Beaufort Duke than she did of York. Margaret seems to have viewed Richard with some suspicion, and it's uncertain whether this is because she saw something in him or his actions that she genuinely feared, or because she was falling under Somerset's spell the same way the king had. The couple was still childless, and that could be used to make York look like a threat, especially when he'd marched on the capital with thousands of armed men. As he stood before those gathered in St Paul's, York recited the following oath. I, Richard Duke of York, confess and beknow that I am, and ought to be, a humble subject and liegeman of you, my sovereign lord, King Henry VI, and owe therefore to bear you faith and truth as my sovereign lord, and shall do all the days unto my life's end, and shall not at any time will or assent that anything be attempted or done against you, your noble person, but wheresoever I shall have knowledge of any such thing, imagined or purposed, I shall, with all speed and diligence possible to me, make that your highness shall have knowledge thereof, and even do all that shall be possible to me to the withstanding thereof, to the utterest of my life. I shall not in any wise take anything upon me against your royal estate or the obedience that is due thereto, nor suffer any other man to do so, as far forth as it shall lie in my power to let it. And I shall also come at your commandment, whensoever I shall be called by the same, in humble and obedient wise. But if I be letted by any sickness or impotency of my person, or any by such other causes as shall be thought reasonable to you, my sovereign lord, I shall never hereafter take upon me to gather any roots, or make any assembly of your people without your commandment or licence, or in my lawful defence, in the interpretation of which my lawful defence and declaration thereof I shall report me at all times to your highness, and, if the case require, unto my peers, nor anything attempt by way of fate against any of your subjects, of what estate, degree, or condition they be. But whensoever I find myself wronged or aggrieved, I shall sue humbly for remedy to your highness, and proceed after the course of your laws, and in none other wise, saving in mine own lawful defence in manner above said, and shall in all things above said and other have me unto your highness as a humble and true subject ought to have him to his sovereign lord. All these things above said I promise truly to observe and keep by the holy evangelists contained in this book that I lay my hand upon, and by the holy cross that I here touch, and by the blessed sacrament of our Lord's body that I shall now with his mercy receive. And over this I agree me, and will that if I at any time hereafter, as with the grace of our Lord I never shall, anything attempt by way of fear or otherwise against your royal majesty and obedience that I owe thereto, or anything I take upon me otherwise than is above expressed, I, from that time forth, be enabled to all manner of worship, estate, and degree, be it such as I now occupy, or any other that might grow unto me in any wise. And this I here have promised and sworn proceedeth of mine own desire and free volunteer, and by no constraining or coercion. In witness of all the which things above written, I, Richard Duke of York, above named, subscribe me with mine own hand and seal, with this mine own seal. By this oath, York's hands were utterly tied. He promised never to raise a force again without Henry's express permission, to come to the king whenever and wherever called upon, and if he felt aggrieved in any way, to sue Henry as his only means of satisfaction. As the premier nobleman in the country, it must have stuck in York's craw to swear that he would make himself answerable to his peers if required. His humiliation was complete as he made the most holy of promises on the Bible, the cross, and the sacrament of Christ's body. He was undone in the most public manner, and he surely had no doubt who was really to blame. Had this action truly come directly from Henry, it should be applauded. The country was in a mess, and York was railing against precisely this because of the weak leadership and his inability to control factions at the heart of government. He was not a unifying figure, but one who drove wedges between leading figures in his kingdom because they didn't see a man to unite behind, but one who could be controlled and used for profit. Had Henry suddenly realised this and taken matters in hand, he might have avoided much of the troubles to come, but it's far more likely that Somerset had planned the whole affair to embarrass and discredit his rival. Henry had failed to act decisively all of his life, allowing Gloucester and Cardinal Beaufort to divide his court, denying the justice called for against Suffolk, running from Cade's rebellion, and failing to stop a private war in the West Country. Given that he made no move against anyone but York, and allowed Somerset to remain comfortably by his side, in spite of the growing hatred Edmund Beaufort was attracting, it seems far more likely that Somerset had been allowed to crush his enemy with the king's goodwill. York was surely outraged, and now all but isolated. Grafton's Chronicle, compiled during the reign of Elizabeth I, recounts an interesting story from this period. From the documentation that he had seen, Grafton didn't believe that this was a display of York's intent to take the crown. For many things, to common judgment, declared the Duke of York's truth and innocence in this case. First, his free and voluntary coming to the king, when he with his power was able to counter the king's puissance, which was an open token and manifest argument that he neither meant treason nor yet fraud. Secondarily, his humble submission, his reasonable requests, and profitable petitions for the poor commons were judged no points of a man that desired sovereignty or rule above other. The writer clearly discerned an act of loyalty rather than betrayal in York's actions at Dartford, but just after the Duke's arrest, he sets out another story. A rumour sprang throughout London that Edward, Earl of March, son and heir apparent to the said Duke, a young prince of great wit and much stomach, accompanied with a strong army of marchmen, was coming to London, which tidings sore astounded the Queen and the whole council. Grafton is only able to report the tale as a rumour, yet it appeared to have enough substance to unnerve the Queen and council. The passage also makes it quite clear who was viewed as holding the reins by this point, since no mention of the king's reaction is recorded. Grafton may well have been drawing on Fabian's earlier report that tidings daily sprang that Edward was marching on London with a strong power of Welshmen and Marchmen, and that this frightened the Queen and the council into releasing York. By this point, Edward was 9 years old, still a few weeks from his 10th birthday. His ferocious martial reputation when he was older may have created this rumour, but it's possible that it was true. Cecily was still at Ludlow, and would have understood well that the Earl of March, Edward, was able to call upon men of that border region in his time of need. As York was a popular figure at Ludlow, and had once held the earldom himself, his imprisonment was a motive to muster an army and march to his relief. It's possible that Cecily planned the move, using her son as a figurehead, and it would have been an early blooding in the power of quick military action for the boy with an army at his command. Whether the army in fact set out or not remains unclear, but it appears that the rumour was enough to rock the government and win York his freedom. Richard was allowed to return to Ludlow, under another, more definite cloud. The gloves were now officially off, and York had made his play against Somerset and been thwarted. He had perhaps underestimated Edmund Beaufort's popularity and influence with the king and queen, which was proportionate to the hatred brewing against him in the nation. Just as Suffolk had done, Somerset was accruing blame for the mistakes of the government and unpopularity for his association with them. He was already widely blamed for the losses in Normandy, and had now placed himself in a position to absorb the king's unpopularity. The vital question regarding York's actions during the period is once more his motive. Traditionally, this episode is viewed as an early play by York for the throne, undone by his own misreading of the situation, but that view simply doesn't stand the test of the evidence of his words or actions. There's a very strong sense of York feeling that he was forced to do what he perceived as his duty by removing those he blamed for leading Henry astray. However, there can be no doubt there was a heavy element of self-interest at work. York had been repeatedly pushed to the margins of the government for years with no good reason, and had been forced to watch as lesser and less capable men had filled shoes that he must have believed were rightfully his. These two motives are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but offered York a legitimate reason to pursue personal goals and more noble aims simultaneously. In his letters, the Duke swore continuing allegiance to the king, but said that he could no longer stand by as Somerset and others about Henry destroyed the country. This fits with both motives if he wished to improve his own position and see justice restored to an ailing government. The likelihood that he was acting in good faith is supported by his actions at Blackheath. He opened himself up to charges of treason by taking an army into the field, but he never gave a hint that he was acting against Henry, insisting only that he sought Somerset's removal. If further proof is required, then his eagerness to disband his huge army and walk into Henry's tent when he believed he'd secured Somerset's arrest is strong testament. If he'd wanted Henry's crown at this stage, he would surely have wanted to use such a large, well-supplied army. If Henry's message that Somerset was under arrest had taken the wind from his sails, he would still have wanted to keep the army in place to assert his position and perhaps invent a cause to push Henry from the throne. Instead, he sent his strength away and went to pay homage to the king. These are not the actions of a man bent on taking the crown, though they are somewhat naive for a man of York's experience. Walking into a trap displays a lack of guile and political cunning at odds with the notion of a man plotting a long and deep assault on the throne. The year 1452 saw York show his hand and fail. He was in open opposition to Somerset, and as long as Edmund Beaufort retained the almost blind favour of the weak king and his increasingly formidable wife, that left York in apparent opposition to Henry himself. If he'd been driven by a deep-rooted desire for the throne, then he'd botched the whole affair and been left in an even worse position, with suspicions about him made manifest. Had his aim been to restore good government, he had naively relied on Henry's word and walked into a trap, allowing Somerset to tell Henry that this is exactly what he had been warning the king about. York was firmly in the wilderness in his march of fortress. It would take a miracle to see him restored, or a disaster. Thank you for joining me again. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back hopefully tomorrow with another reading to try and relieve some of the lockdown boredom. Thank you very much.